A real estate transaction is a high-dollar, legally complex, high-liability transaction, and finding or listing a property is just the first in a series of steps before the transaction is complete. This is often the largest transaction an individual will make in their lifetime, so it's important to do it right. There are many resources available to help, some human and some not, but not all are created equal, especially online resources. One of the most accurate online resources in Utah is UtahRealEstate.com, Utah's largest MLS. Once the property is identified, the buyer or buyer's agent puts in an offer and the seller decides whether to accept, decline, or counter it. This process can go back and forth until the buyer and seller agree on the terms. A seller may receive multiple offers from different parties, which can result in a bidding war between buyers. With multiple offers on the table, experienced advice can help buyers make an offer that stands out. A lot of concepts are addressed in the initial offer. It's important to get these right up front because it gets harder to change these after the buyer and seller go under contract. Once the buyer and seller agree on terms, they go under contract. At this point, the seller is required to provide written disclosures about any problems or other material information the seller knows about the property. The buyer will decide whether to have the property professionally inspected. Real estate sales in Utah are as is, which means all properly disclosed issues become the buyer's responsibility after purchase. The buyer may request changes to the contract based on the inspection results. The seller decides whether or not to agree with any of the proposals made by the buyer. Ultimately, the buyer decides whether or not to continue with the sale based on the due diligence conducted. If the buyer is getting a loan, the buyer will be working on the loan throughout the purchase process. Loans through government programs may require extra steps, like inspections or appraisals. If it's a conventional loan, buyers need to make sure that the underwriter of the loan signs off on all of the purchase terms. Utah's standard contracts give buyers a deadline to cancel the contract if the terms of the financing are not coming together. By the deadline, the buyer and seller attend settlement, where the paperwork is signed and submitted, beginning the closing process. Settlement begins the process of funding, getting the seller the money, and recording, getting the buyer the deed. Funding and recording trigger the time when the seller must move out of the property. Prior to settlement, the buyer may inspect the property to make sure it's in roughly the same condition it was when the buyer and seller went under contract. Also, the buyer can check to make sure that any items agreed upon are still in the property. If the buyer discovers that something is not in order during the walkthrough, the issue should be resolved by the buyer and seller before the settlement deadline. Buying or selling a home will likely be the most complex transaction anyone will make, with a lot of steps, legal concepts, and liability. Plus, there's a lot of money and emotion involved. Luckily, there are professionals and experts ready and willing to make sense of the process for both the buyer and seller. Because with a decision this big, it's best done right.